so slow off the mark here?
Because we prefer comfort than challenged, in truth.
Yeah.
And a lot of us do the same in our private lives. Let's not be too hypocritical about this. But it's much easier to say it doesn't really matter, and it was not really happening anyway. But to look at the consequences of what's happening is the adult thing to do, and that's what we have to do now.
And you look at these beautiful animals and then hear that we have lost more than half of all the actual animals, not the species, but the actual animals, just in the last 30, 40 years.
Yes, absolutely so. Because we've got very, very sophisticated ways of killing them.
Yeah, yeah. And we are in danger of losing half the species in this century.
Yes.
Multiple studies have shown us this. So I'm going to come back to you, but speaking of global politics, we have a prime minister here, and
you're not going to put it all on me, are you?
Yeah. I said I'm a big fan of your work, Prime Minister, and I've said that publicly, and I think you really represent a breath of fresh air in world politics. But I know that in leading your country, you're interested in improving the intergenerational well-being of New Zealanders and build an international reputation for New Zealand. And how do those challenges inform your approach to the climate crisis?
I think you can probably put them in the same basket. What greater threat to our well-being is there than the current threat of climate change?
Yeah.
And we have a term in New Zealand that's unique to New Zealand because it's a phrase from Indigenous New Zealanders, Māori. It's this term, kaitiakitanga. And it means guardianship, specifically guardianship of our environment. And so the way I'd like to think about us in politics taking on the challenge of climate change is that we have a short term, a 3-year term, that's our political cycle, in which I see the challenge is to embed in that period of time as deeply as we can the infrastructure for long-term change. One of the biggest threats I think that we have, and you talked about why we're not making enough progress, political cycles. This needs to be something that we embed in our national psyches, in our political psyches, and in our action, and it needs to endure beyond us as individuals. And so if we can do anything, we will be creating legislation which embeds those targets, that ambition that we need, and then right through to the basic pragmatic things, like planting 1 billion trees over 10 years, creating investment funds, doing each of the things that will set us on a long-term path for guardianship, because that's what we all have to take the responsibility for.
I've been so happy at the proposals you've made since you took office. It puts to mind a saying from an American humorist in the 19th century, Mark Twain, who said, "Do the right thing. You'll gratify your friends and astonish your enemies."
And in politics, you'll surprise everyone. So, but ultimately, I think civic society has done an incredible job. The young people have been the leaders that we need. Now everyone is looking to us.
Yeah.
And so we've got the rule book. We know what's required. It's about a matter of getting on and doing it and turning what has been seen as a threat with a great deal of pessimism and fear into an opportunity.
Yeah.
We have the chance here to transition and future-proof our economies as well. And that might be jarring if we do it quickly, or if we take a longer track, it can be something we can prepare our people for. And so I think it's the only option.
Yeah, you still have some resistance, don't you?
Yes.
And how do you deal with that? I mean, I'm asking for very practical reasons. There are policymakers here who are sometimes really put on their back foot by the fierceness of the resistance to even recognizing the reality of the climate crisis.
There's good cause to be optimistic still, though. 10 years ago, when I first came into Parliament, I remember standing at a town hall meeting and speaking passionately about the issue of climate change and being roundly booed. including, I think, by members of my own family. But even in that 10-year period, how dramatic the shift has been. No longer do you have the significant questioning of the science that we even had perhaps in that period of time. So how do we move in the face of resistance? We don't do it alone. We build a movement with us, and I want to acknowledge the work of Sir David, a voice of authority, trust and respect, and to all those leaders who use the platform that they have, it creates the space for us as politicians to do the right thing.
Yeah, yeah. So the business community has an extremely important role, and unlike New Zealand, some countries have a challenging period for leadership these days. And there are actually many countries where democracy is not working the way many of us think it should. And the business community is stepping up and providing leadership. Not all, but Anand Mahindra certainly is. And I was going to ask you at the end for a pledge or a commitment, but I know that just recently you did that. So tell us what you've just announced as an act of leadership in the Mahindra Group.
Thank you, Vice President. When you're asked to be the only businessman on a panel about environment, it sort of fills you with a little bit of trepidation. You wonder whether you're going to be the fall guy or the dartboard for everything. But knowing that you were moderating this, I was very willing, because you've been a very great supporter of ours and a cheerleader. So I'm delighted, Vice President, to share with you and to share with those who were not at the Global Climate Action Summit in California in September, that I did make a pledge on behalf of all 220,000 colleagues of mine in our group. It's not the largest group in India or in the world. It is a sizable group. It's $20 billion with 100 companies. But I did commit that the entire Mahindra Group and all its companies would be carbon neutral 10 years before the Paris Agreement deadline by 2040.
That's great. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And if more business CEOs and leaders would follow your example, that would really accelerate the progress. We're seeing a lot of change in India, aren't we?
Absolutely. And what I think we're seeing is that India, unlike many other countries, including many in the West, Vice President, is not dialing down on its ambitions. In fact, 3 climate groups had created a climate tracker report, and they have announced and stated that out of 32 country survey they've done, only 7 are still on track to meet their Paris Agreement commitments. And India is one of them, and I'm very proud to state that here today. So India is not backing off. As far as the business community is concerned, I believe that India is also in the forefront of having a business community that unequivocally recognizes that this is not a problem that we are solving alone. This is not a nice thing to do. This is not something you check on your CSR box. This is the biggest business opportunity of the next few decades.
Yeah.
So any country that dials down, thank you very much. We'll pick up the opportunities if you don't want them.
Yeah, you know, that's such a great point to make. In my country, in the United States, the fastest growing job is solar installer, and it's growing 9 times faster than the average job growth in the country. Second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. The opportunities for tens of millions of jobs, not only in the US, but all around the world, for retrofitting buildings. You know, roughly a quarter of the global warming pollution can be traced to highly inefficient buildings that waste heat in the winter and cool in the summer. And you can create jobs in every community. They can't be outsourced. They're by nature in the community, and give an increase to the secular demand in the global economy on a sustainable basis at a time when we got the warning on Monday here in Davos that the risks of a downturn have increased. Well, now is the time for an increase in secular demand and moving quickly to seize the opportunities in this transition make all the sense in the world. And young people are calling for it. And I want to turn to you, Akira. because you represent a new generation of purpose-driven leaders and people involved in business. What are you doing to help mobilize other young people in Japan and elsewhere?
Definitely, thank you very much. Actually, I have an issue that watching these series, that just makes me so emotional in a way. But please don't take everyone, the youth generation, young generation is too emotional. But we are, as it's just mentioned, that we are just purpose-driven, and then we know what is right and wrong to us. And we are just taking that, like, we as a community, of course, as a global shapers community, but at the same time, as a community that we work in every day in the very rural basis or very local basis, that we are already doing so much, and we can see that how much we can already achieve as a local basis. So that's why I'm here after this to also present the pledge from the young generations for everyone to get on board. Yeah, then this is really the welcoming and opening opportunity for everyone to take their own voices in. Because for our young generation, then you just seen in the video as well before, David Attenborough's video, that for us, young generation, taking action for climate change or the sustainability or biodiversity, whatever you call it, is just as important as just breathing. It is so natural and normal for us.
Well, thank you very much. I've been so impressed and so moved by your generation expressing in such a passionate way the reasons why we have to do more. And Sir David, you must feel some times where you have deep emotions coming from observing the beauty that you chronicle in your work and realizing the fragility and the threat to it. Over the years, you personally have changed, haven't you, in highlighting the threat to the natural environment. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I think so. I mean, in the 1950s, I think I wasn't alone. I think most naturalists were aware that we could damage the environment and that a species might become extinct, and we could do something to stop that. And so we were very proud of the fact that we saw the Arabian oryx extinct in the wild, but had the wit at least to see that there were individuals in zoos around the world, and we could get them together, and we could reconstitute a breeding herd, and we could reintroduce them. Well, okay, we did. But of course, that was a very, very simple problem with a relatively simple solution. We didn't even then dawn on us that what we were wrecking were not individual species, but ecosystems.
Yes.
That was the catastrophe.
Yeah.
And that we still haven't cracked.
Yeah.
Haven't solved that problem.
Yeah. I focus mainly on the climate crisis. I think it's by far the most serious problem that we face. But in truth, it is the most serious manifestation of an underlying collision between human civilization as we have presently organized it and the ecological system of our planet. We're losing forests at a rate of 1 football field per second. We're seeing the acidification of the oceans. We're seeing the loss of wetlands, the loss of living species, as we mentioned before. And that's not something that can be easily undone. I find myself that there is a risk of people moving straight from denial to despair without pausing on the intermediate step of actually solving the problem. And I loved your formulation when Hilda Schwab presented the Crystal Award to you last night. You said we have to focus on that intermediate place where it's not just high alarm constantly or doom and gloom, but actually focusing on the practical steps that can be taken. So I thank you for delivering that message.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you started it. Let us pay our respect and thanks to you, because you sounded the alarm a long, long time ago.
Well, you're kind to say that, but I thank you. I simply channeled what my teachers taught me, beginning with Professor Roger Revelle. We were having conversations about it, but thank you. Prime Minister, I'm not going to name any names of your fellow heads of state. I want you to conjure one of them, can be a woman, can be a man. I'm not trying to be overly cute about this.
If it's a woman, it's virtually naming names. There's not many of us out there.
Oh, okay. Well, that's true. But what I'm trying to invite you to do is to have a conversation with one of your fellow heads of state who doesn't want to do anything about the climate crisis, doesn't think it's real or pretends to think it's not real, and is hostile to any efforts to do anything about it. What would you say to him or her?
You know, I wonder whether or not I would say anything or whether I would show them something.
Yeah.
And it only takes a trip to the Pacific to see that climate change isn't a hypothetical. And you don't have to know anything about the science or even have an argument about the science to have someone from one of the Pacific Island nations take you to a place where they used to play as a child on the coast and show you where they used to stand and now where the water rises.
Underwater, yeah.
And so I don't think we have to do it all with words when we can just simply show what's happening as the images that we watched in the beginning have shown. And so where do you take it after that? Well, I think then it's a matter of saying that you don't have to cede power by acting on climate change. There's nothing to fear about your individual political status. Actually, this is about being on the right side of history. And do you want to be a leader that you look back in time and say that you were on the wrong side of the argument when the world was crying out for a solution?
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that, I think.
Yeah, well said, well said. Yeah. Yeah. Anand, when you and I were together in San Francisco a few months ago at the Summit on Climate, this horrible cyclonic storm, a hurricane as we call them in the Western Hemisphere, was hitting the East Coast of the U.S. At the same time, an even more powerful typhoon, same kind of storm, was hitting the Philippines and then onward to Hong Kong. And then the fires were breaking out in California. Every night on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation now. It is just astonishing. But in India, you've had your share of these climate-related disasters. Is that having an impact on public opinion in India?
It certainly is. We've been accustomed to these storms for a while, particularly in some of the geographies. But I have absolutely no doubt right now that when a natural calamity occurs, and they're occurring with greater frequency than they used to, there is no reaction in India, whether it's by the lay population, whether it's by business people or by policymakers. There's no reaction which is regressive and says, oh, well, we've had these before.
Yeah.
Indians somehow are notorious for being fatalistic and accepting. And I think there are good things about being accepting about life and about our fate. But this is not one of the things I think India is taking as simply an act of fate. And again, I believe that the business community, once again, you brought them up, but we were earlier in Davos last year, if you remember, and you and I co-conspired to try and make a call for action.
Yeah.
And at that time, I think about 330 companies had committed to following science-based targets for meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And I'm happy to tell you, you and I both called for more. Our target was 500. We're now at 515 companies who signed up. So there are many believers.
That's great.
There are not that many disbelievers. That's the good news. And in India, I have not come across anyone who doesn't recognize the dangers. I live in Mumbai. Mumbai is meant to be underwater at some point in time. I live on the coast as well. So it's a matter of survival for all of us. For India, it's about staying alive. It's not just about politics. It's not just about business, as I said earlier. It really is a question of staying alive.
Yeah. And just to make one other point with India as an example, I could use my own country as well. The same fuels that are burned that create the global warming pollution and the climate crisis also, at the same time, create the kind of air pollution that makes people sick. And India has a particular challenge with air pollution in cities. And in my country, we have this as well. And in many places, China and India are well known, but there are quite a few other countries around the world that have this. But this is now also, particularly for the young generation, a motivating factor in saying we want cleaner air and cleaner water. And so linking the health consequences of our dependence on fossil fuels to the solutions to the climate crisis, I think is a step forward.
No, absolutely. And young people, as you know, India is one of the youngest countries in the world. And the vast majority of people are under 25 years old. They understand that it is a matter of survival. You use that wonderful phrase, Sir David, about this is our home. And that's the message every young person in India has received from people who have some wisdom about this, that look, treat this like your home. This is not a hotel. Neither you nor your successors are going to be able to check out of here. And I think everyone's got that message.
Yeah. Of course, Japan and you wanted to comment on that?
Thank you. I'd like to, in a way, if I can, revert the question to all of you, because we, as a young people, we know it is the matter, and then it is the crisis, and we need to work on. And for example, like we are already doing so much in our own capacity. For example, myself, coming from a very rural community, already working on the zero waste, that we have already achieved up to 80%. That's how much we can do as a very small group of the people. But at the same time, I also respect how much you have already worked on climate change and all these issues. But I see the gap between the young people doing so much in their capacity, between how we can also get your buttons for our generation to be passed on. At the same time, how can we bridge this generation also transitioning so that we can also have the capacity together with all of you to actually moving forward to make change. What's the advice?
Yeah. Well, I think we've all got to
office.
take inspiration from your generation and move forward much faster. This is a challenge unlike any other. But the fact that we have the solutions now, as was said earlier, makes it particularly frustrating for people who want to push for faster action. But I do think that we are making slow progress. Now, I qualify that because we've gone for 3 years with no increase in emissions. But last year, the emissions started increasing again, actually in 2017, and then last year even more. So this is a warning sign. The Paris Agreement was a great success, but one of the reasons why it's so important that the World Economic Forum has featured this session and has so many sessions on climate this week is that this year kicks off the cycle of increased commitments. And in the fall of this year, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who will also be here this week, is holding a special UN summit following up on the IPCC report. And then the following year, that's when every nation is going to be called on to increase its ambition. So the old cliche is you have to walk before you can run. We are seeing the beginnings of progress, but we have to accelerate that progress dramatically. Sir David, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the Prime Minister. If you could have a heart-to-heart with a head of state who is not yet doing anything on this, what would you say?
Think of the children.
Think of the children.
Think of your children and your children's children, and of what we are doing to the planet at the moment. And could you look them in the eye and say, I knew what could be done to stop the degradation of the environment and of the climate, but it was too difficult and rather boring.
Yeah.
And I failed to do it. And you are now going to take the consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of the ghost of Christmas future. Take a look. Do you want to be able to, do you want to have to say that? So we're running out of time here, but Prime Minister, I want to talk about economic impact, because sometimes there is this cartoonish view that we have to choose between the climate and the environment on the one hand and the economy and jobs on the other. We talked earlier about how many new jobs can be created and are being created with this sustainability revolution. But you have a unique initiative that's part of what's called the just transition.
Yes.
And with men and women who've been employed in the carbon fuel sector, you think that part of the world's approach to solving the climate crisis has to include an intense focus on a just transition for them. What are you doing in that regard?
Actually, what we're inclined to believe is that any economy needs to start thinking about our measures of its success beyond just our economic success. And the traditional forms of measuring that have, of course, tended to be GDP and growth. And for us, that just doesn't tell an entire story. You can have, for instance, a country that's perceived to be thriving while their environment is degrading or while they're contributing to our global emissions. And so that's why we've started looking at doing things differently, not just having a scorecard, but this year, for the first time, and I see our Minister of Finance who's having to do actually all the hard work, I'm just the Johnny-come-lately, we will be undertaking a wellbeing budget where we're embedding that notion of making decisions that aren't just about growth for growth's sake, but how are our people faring? How's their overall well-being and their mental health, for instance? How is our environment, the clean and our fresh waterways faring in our state of growth? And these are the measures that I think give us a true sense of our success. And within that, of course, we need to then factor in, of course, as we transition our economy, how our people are faring in terms of their economic well-being and capacity. And so I'll give you an example. We have a region in New Zealand that has traditionally been an area for oil and gas exploration. But we announced last year that if we are to be honest with ourselves about our future, we need to transition away from oil and gas and fossil fuels. So we have ceased to offer any more permits for oil and gas exploration in New Zealand offshore. Now that was a significant move, but that was for us about anticipating where we need to move and saying, unless we anticipate that change, make that decision now, there will be a very jarring experience for the people currently employed in those industries. And that's what a just transition is all about. And so now we're using things like our green investment funds, we're using other mechanisms we've created around provincial growth to start investing in ideas like hydrogen and so on, to start transitioning our economies, and again, feed into those overall measures of well-being.
Well, that's great leadership, and thank you very much. And Akira, I'm going to
We'll
give
let you know how we go.
I'm going to give you the last word, but beforehand, I want to ask Anand Mahindra, going from the nation-state level to the company level, you've made this very impressive pledge. You have to have a vision of how you can safeguard the jobs of the people, the women and men who work for you, and so you must see new opportunities opening up.
Yes, Vice President, it's linked to the point I made earlier about this being the next few decades' biggest business opportunity. And you also alluded to the fact that right here in Davos yesterday, I think you mentioned, but even earlier in the last few weeks, there's this kind of opinion that's been simmering and coming up now that we are possibly facing a recession. And there are many sane voices now talking about that. They're not doomsday predictors. And frankly, a lot of that might be self-inflicted. Politically, in Europe in particular, it didn't have to be that way. The world was on a good path. If somebody came to me and said, can you come up with one good idea that could serve as a trigger for reigniting growth, I would say the opportunity is in climate change.
Yeah.
Why does it take so much rocket scientists' brain power to come to that conclusion? Happily, I think investors and insurers are beginning to demand that from companies. So I believe that there is an answer to the jobs crisis. It is dealing with climate change. There's an answer to recession. It's dealing with climate change. I think we're almost upon that recognition.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I take comfort from the old cliche story about the economists who predicted 12 of the last 5 recessions. So maybe we'll escape. So let me close by asking Akira Sakano to tell us about a very unique initiative that the Global Shapers are taking. Voice for the Planet. Tell us about it.
Yes, thank you very much. So we've already heard the science has never been so clear and as urgent as now, that we need to take action now for the climate change, and no one questioned that. So as a young generation, the Global Shapers community, we'd like to welcome every one of you here to join our pledge, which is the Voice for the Planet, to add your voice and to contribute yourself to the action for the climate change. So this is the pledge that started as a Global Shapers community that we initiated. And then as a young people, I already mentioned, for us, taking action for the climate change is as important and as natural as just breathing. And then I believe everyone should be on the same place, should be on the same stage. And then that's what I'd like to present. So go to the website, voicefortheplanet.org. Please bring out your phone now. Go to the website, voicefortheplanet.org, and then please add your voice. Please bring out your commitment, and then please share so that not only everyone in this room, but also everyone around you also join this pledge. And then together, I'm sure we can safeguard our planet. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Congratulations on, the Global Shapers have done such wonderful work, and thank you for this initiative. And it's voicefortheplanet.org, and it's a hashtag Voice for the Planet also?
As well, when you share.
On Twitter? Okay, very good.
Great.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close this panel by thanking our participants, but I want to say in advance that we want you to stay in your seats because we're going to leave and then they're going to reset the stage, and we're going to have the great pleasure of hearing Sir David show us some more highlights of this fantastic new series. But I think this has been a great panel, and I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Sir David Attenborough, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, Anand Mahindra, and Akira Sakano. Thank you all very much.